Welcome to another great week on the Ari Goldkind Show on Sirius XM Canada Talks Channel 167. As with almost every week, except for when I'm my own guest, which is fun to do, Olivier Knox from the Washington Post, who writes the Daily 202, is our guest for the full hour tonight. Olivier is a great writer, a great journalist. He is located right in Washington, D.C., and we're going to have a really interesting conversation about a whole number of hot button issues in the States right now: Biden, China, the 2024 race, whether Biden will run again. Olivier at Knox on anti-social media, OKNOX, is a great follow if you do use anti-social media, and he'll be our guest coming up for the entire hour after my relatively short monologue this week, because we have so much to get into with Olivier. Let's talk about a couple of stories that have stood out to me over the last few days. Hockey Canada. This is Canada Talks Channel 167. So this is a country, with present company excluded, that is obsessed with hockey. I'm not. But Hockey Canada, we're told, is a scandal. It's not a scandal. Do you know what the scandal of Hockey Canada is? Just what a non-scandal it is. And this week, as we're speaking, as you're listening to me, our House of Commons is in the middle of hearings where only the lawyers again get rich, only the lawyers succeed. All the groups that want to make money off of calling this a scandal, or that Canada has a sexual assault epidemic in its hockey ranks, all of these people who make their bread and butter doing it have tried to convince you, the public, that there is a scandal. So let's just take a minute and wind down what the scandal is and why it's not a scandal. There are two central time periods for these allegations: 2003 and the one that started it all out in 2018. Let's keep them separate. The 2003 allegation is a woman unconscious or incapacitated where 6 men are raping her. That is sexual assault, if that's true. And apparently there are portions of it on video. There is no reporter who has said that woman has ever come forward. There is no reporter, to my knowledge, that said she's ever gone to the police. We don't know what her views are, what her wishes are, what her feelings on the subject are, if it happened, as apparently the reporting says it did. That suggests to me that calling the 2003 incident a scandal is premature. We don't know what happened. We haven't seen the video. A reporter has. We don't know what the wishes of the young woman are, but we know that Hockey Canada didn't know about this until about a week ago. So how can there be a scandal at Hockey Canada if Hockey Canada didn't know about this until a week ago? Now, I'm not here to defend Hockey Canada, because to me, they are completely spineless. I'll get to why Hockey Canada is spineless in a moment, for a reason that will surprise you. But if there's no evidence or suggestion Hockey Canada buried this under the rug, paid a lawsuit, ignored it, told somebody not to go to the police, or any other example that you're clever enough to imagine in your mind, where's the scandal? There's an allegation from 19 years ago that 6 young men committed a crime. Well, that happens. Are we sort of at the point now where nobody in the NCAA, or no young men in the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball, soccer in Europe commit acts 19 years ago that have gone unnoticed or unreported? But let's get to where this all starts in 2018. And this is the key. In 2018, a young woman goes to the police. She goes to the police and says, I was sexually assaulted. A dedicated sexual investigations unit, the sexual assault team in London, Ontario, investigates it. This is also investigated by one of the top law firms in Canada. We'll get to that in a moment. And the police, even though police charge everybody with sexual assault, let's say you're listening to me tonight and your name is Joe. Well, if Jane goes to the police station and says, you, Joe, sexually assaulted her 5 years ago, even though there's no DNA, no corroboration, no evidence, no witnesses, there is proof that she hates you, proof that you're going through a child custody dispute, proof that you cheated on her, you're getting charged with sex assault. Keep that in mind for the next couple minutes. And it even got harder for police to not charge somebody after Gomeshi. and a Globe and Mail article called Unfounded. This young woman goes to the police in 2018. She doesn't want to go. Her mother makes her. Her mother starts this. She is recorded saying this is consensual. She's on now, whether it's is or it isn't, we don't know. That's not the point of this. But the police declined to lay charges, which is almost unheard of post Gomeshi. She then has civil lawyers that go to Hockey Canada and sues them and says she wants $3.5 million. Rather than Hockey Canada going, no, we're not wasting any money on this, not the 2% of our reserve fund. We're not wasting, we're going to fight this. If the police say it's not sex assault, if the players say it's not sex assault, if there's no criminal charges, we're not going to sign any money from the parents and players who pay into this fund and a little bit of government money to pay you. But instead, Hockey Canada does what almost every business would do, which is they get out in front of it, and to avoid legal fees, PR headaches, nightmares, all of this stuff, they have a quiet settlement with an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. You're familiar with those from Weinstein and other cases. So what ends up happening is this young woman, for charges that the police don't even charge on, again, you got to remember that, gets a check. Hockey Canada capitulates because that's what these companies do because they don't want PR, after Gomeshi especially. And now the London police chief says, well, we're going to reopen the investigation. We're going to reopen the investigation. That is an example of political pressure. Now, maybe there's a new smoking gun. Maybe there's new evidence that we don't know about. But for a police service as a result of public pressure to reopen an investigation, many people may celebrate that, and police investigations should always remain open when there's new evidence. But when it's done as part of a PR exercise, and your parliament this week, rather than dealing with inflation, housing prices, interest rates, crime, immigration, the climate, they're busy pretending this is a scandal and that two incidents, 2003 and 2018, means that Hockey Canada is riddled with sexual abusers. It's a false narrative, it's an insulting narrative, and it's a dangerous narrative to all of the young players who would never dream of committing a crime. And it also assumes, as we should have learned, whether it be Johnny Depp, Amber Heard, whether it be Gomeshi, that you don't presume somebody guilty when they so much as hasn't had a trial yet. I'm going to talk about more Tamara Leach. You know my views on that. But just this week, a Superior Court judge tore into the ridiculous and horrid Justice of the Peace decision in Ottawa that kept her in jail for 2 weeks. If you want to see more on that, there's a long interview, 45 minutes, I did with Rupa Subramaya, who will be our guest on a future Ari Goldkind show. It's on YouTube. Just Google Rupa, Ari Goldkind, True North, Enemy of the State. I think that's a 45-minute YouTube video that you really will enjoy. Back in 2 minutes with Olivier Knox. We're going to go south of the border to Washington with a little bit of Canadian content. Don't go anywhere, we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Ari Goldkind Show. As I said at the top of the hour, Olivier Knox is somebody that we've had on before. He was a great guest. And given that I always like to go south of the border, even though this is Canada Talks, Channel 167, Olivier writes the Daily 202 for the Washington Post. And given all of the tweets and things I talk about the Washington Post and what's news and everything like that, we wanted to have Olivier back because so much is happening. Great to have you back on the Ari Goldkind Show.
My pleasure.
What'd you write about today?
What did I write about today? I wrote about there's a lot of tension between Democratic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and the Biden administration over her apparent plans to visit Taiwan on an upcoming swing through Asia. And the tension has been reported. A lot of folks are reporting all these leaks out of the National Security Council, talking about all the people trying to dissuade her from going. And I took a slightly different tack, and I wrote about how President Biden and Vladimir Putin have made it harder for her to go. Biden, by saying 3 times since last August that he would step in militarily to defend Taiwan if Beijing were to attack, and Putin by raising the stakes for any conflict like this with the war in Ukraine. You know, everyone has been looking to see what lessons, if any, China is learning from that conflict. But anything that raises the stakes for that kind of visit is not good for Nancy Pelosi going to Taiwan.
So let's talk about one of the things that I think is the most interesting and under talked about issue of our time is the China threat, and whether it be cybersecurity, whether it be spyware. I know you've had your eye on that, and I'll want to come to that. Explain in layperson's terms what the stakes are here. And you said something that I don't think ever gets talked about, which is how does China view the Russia-Ukraine semi kind of war? Because to me, there's nothing that happens geopolitically that isn't in China's long-term interests anymore.
Well, that is one of the interesting things about this relationship, right? It's become something of a commonplace in this analysis that this has been a process decades in the making. That China, quote unquote, plays the long game, and it's become a commonplace because it's largely true. One of the things that I think is really interesting about the way China has risen is they've used some of the infrastructure of international relations to their benefits. So WTO, World Trade Organization complaints, for example, they've used some of the things that the United States used to use, they've turned to use. They say, well, if you can use that to your benefit, we can use that to our benefit. They have, in climate negotiations, they very cleverly have built in a way that they can say, well, we're technically a developing economy, so we don't need to meet the same kinds of emission reductions that you do. So that's sort of that's been a big part of the game. Obviously, we've not seen a direct military confrontation apart from ships passing a little too close to each other in the Taiwan Straits, airplanes intruding on Taiwan's exclusion zone, things like that. But the economic warfare has been, ever since China entered the World Trade Organization, they've really maximized their economic leverage. You have a very gradual. I'm sorry, I'm going on at length here, but there's a very gradual waking up of America's biggest corporations about the problems with China. Very gradual. They used to go to the Bush White House, the George W. Bush White House, and say, the Chinese are killing us. They require us to hand over, when we want to manufacture there, they require us to hand over intellectual property. They effectively retain ownership of whatever we invest in, whatever we build in China. And the Bush folks would say, well, okay, it doesn't sound fair. Let's take some actions. And the corporate folks would say, no. And then in the Obama era, for the first 6 years or so, they would go to the White House, same exact belly aching about the Chinese economic, I don't want to say something too strong here, but basically about their relationship with China, the rules of the road in China. And the Obama folks would say, well, gosh, that sounds unfair. Let's do something about it. And the CEOs would say, no, we don't want to endanger our market access. Last 2 years of Obama, big shift. Corporate America starts saying, you know what, actually, we can't seem to repatriate our profits. We can't actually own anything on the ground. They are very deliberately undermining us. Okay, let's do something about it. And that sort of came at a fortuitous time in a way, because, of course, Donald Trump built part of his presidential brand on the idea that he would be confrontational with China.
So, with China and where it is now, and I will come to the spyware because it's an interesting issue in Canada too. We have the YY problem here, which, the politicians, right, depending on who gets lobbied on which day, have different views. But, you talked about the long game, and that is a cliche that is often used for China. Mm-hmm. I always like the cliche, and I want we'll discuss it for a moment. They're playing chess while we're playing checkers. I always look at China that way, because in chess, it's the same thing you said, which is the long game. You may give up a rook, you may give up a bishop, but you're going to end up getting hammered at the end by the right strategy. Are there any areas that you, as a writer who covers not just Washington, but the world, that you've deduced that America is doing something better, smarter than China, where we've got the edge,
right,
where Americans should say, forget that China threat, we're doing better now?
So there's no set of circumstances in which I think you could say, forget the China threat.
Right.
No.
That's what I was thinking and hoping you'd say, but I always want to be optimistic.
They are. They're rewriting the rules of international relations in some interesting ways. The way that the two countries use international aid, for example, the United States will provide microcredit. They'll help build infrastructure, things like that. the Chinese come in, and not only do they use Chinese workers to build the infrastructure that they provide, but they've used debt traps in some countries, where they say, "Oh, well, you couldn't pay us for this infrastructure project, so now we own this port," for example.
And talk about that, because as somebody who's traveled a lot, the Caribbean, Latin America, you can't drive, and I didn't mean to interrupt you here because I want you to explain this to Canadians who may not know exactly what you mean by debt traps. And I think that's a fancy word for if you drive around just for Canadians, and Olivier, just so you know, in the winter, we like to go south. It's cold here. It's sort of like your weather, but even worse. And if you drive around certain islands in the Caribbean, I'm not going to touch on Africa because not too many Canadians vacation or spend time in Africa unless it's where their family and relatives are from.
Okay.
You can't drive around the Caribbean anymore without seeing this highway, this hospital, this plant, this school, this library, this government building that doesn't have a sign in front, literally not hiding it, that basically says bought and paid for by China. And this is all through debt funding. And now explain to people what these debt traps are and why they're so dangerous to the sovereignty of nations that used to look to the United States. Forget Canada for a moment. But that used to look to the United States as the superpower, but is now beholden much more to the East.
So I'm going to separate these two issues just a little bit.
Please.
One of the things that the United States did with international aid was the idea was that it would buy goodwill by helping these countries to develop infrastructure, develop schools and the like. So there's a George W. Bush Expressway in Tanzania that connects some plants inland with the ports. Okay, the United States doesn't own that; the Tanzanians do. The Chinese said, okay, this whole thing about buying goodwill with international aid, this seems smart, but we're going to add a layer, and that layer is we're not going to hire a lot of local workers. We're going to build this ourselves, so the money kind of stays in our system. And then to the degree that these countries are co-financing these projects, when it turns out that they can't actually meet the terms of their co-financing agreement, then we will own this thing. And this thing can be a highway or it can be a port. In other words, it can be kind of critical infrastructure that the local country is dependent on to generate income, in private sector and public sector, to generate income. And that's what I mean by the debt trap. So there's a lot of question in foreign policy circles, at least in the United States, about how effective the Chinese have been at buying goodwill. And some of the folks that I've talked to in the administration and out say, well, you know what? This hasn't actually been tested. We haven't seen a situation in which the Chinese were able to call upon these countries for, symbolically helpful votes at the UN or things like that. But that could be coming. And that's one of the things that I'm watching with the Chinese response to Ukraine, right? Because one of the things a couple of things have clearly taken them aback a bit. One has been, of course, the Russian military failure on the ground, which surprised pretty much everybody I talked to. But the other is the international response. International response has been much more mixed than you would think it is if you heard only from Washington, right? The language here is Putin is isolated, Russia's isolated, they're cut off. Well, they're not.
That's not. I was going to say that's not my understanding of where Russia is. Right, Russia's having a very good year.
Well, they're not having a great year, and they've got a lot of long-term problems. But for example, India hasn't cut them off. A lot of Africa hasn't cut them off. So there are all these countries that are actually not signed on to the sanctions regime that we're promoting. But still, the fact that I think a lot of people expected Western Europe to cave much more quickly. And they haven't yet, but people expect them to cave because of their dependence on Russian energy. So there's been this real interesting test of wills. The final result is still very much to be determined. But I think the Chinese are watching the military failures, and they're watching the American Western allied response as a diplomatic success. And so they've been doing things like making their economy a little more resistant to sanctions, and they've been going around and cultivating countries already. So we could see, obviously, if China makes a move on Taiwan, that's a crisis of a different order. But part of that'll merit watching is whether they can, in fact, turn these development projects into actual leverage. and potentially get, a majority of the UN General Assembly to say like, this is okay.
It's funny. I was watching something where it was Prince Harry at the UN General Assembly the other day, and I constantly wonder to myself, what is that body for anymore? What is it really, other than an excuse for very corrupt people to get parking tickets paid for in New York City, that George Costanza would give his left what to get those parking spots? Really, as a seasoned writer, as a grizzled veteran of Washington who watches this other body, I mean, maybe this is too much of a digression, or you just said UN General Assembly and I was picturing Harry there and I was like, okay, who's next? Meghan? I mean, what is that body? What's it for? What's it doing for the world?
Well, it's a totally fair question. Obviously, at its core, the UN was designed to avoid great power conflict again, right? And to that extent, it's been successful. We have not, in fact, had a full-scale military conflict between the members of the Security Council. The General Assembly is a much more symbolic function, and then there are a lot of other, satellite agencies that do development aid. There are UN peacekeepers and the rest. So it has some functions. I think the one body that people tend to point to the most when they're being critical is the UN Human Rights Council, which has some of the most extravagant abusers of human rights as part of its membership. So that's been a punchline in international politics for a quarter century at least, as long as I've been covering foreign policy and
the
politics.
Saudi Arabia, the Iran, the China, always going after Israel.
Just bring Syria in. Just go for the whole go for the whole full Monty here. Just get all the worst ones on the council. Yeah, I mean, so that that's the body that people tend to point to the most and say like, what are we doing here? How is it possible that countries with very well-known records of rampant rights abuses, how are they elected to sit on this thing
with a straight face? Yes, right.
To then criticize Israel or the United States.
Right. Like it's not like half the time now, we'll get into some other hot topics. I mean, I sometimes read the news, whether it be your outlet, not your writing, but your outlet. And I think, is this an Onion article? Is this the Babylon Bee? Seth Dillon couldn't come up with something so clever. I mean, yesterday, and I talked about this, not yesterday, 2 days ago, I talked about this at length. And again, you can comment on it if you want. I'm not sure if you saw it, but the other night in Rochester, New York, 2 police officers were ambushed in their car. Now, this is Rochester, New York. It's not Washington. It's not Manhattan, not LA, Chicago, San Francisco. One cop was killed, and there were 17 shots fired into the cop car, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, Olivier, I'm 48. I don't know how old you are, but
52.
You're 52. There was a day when I was growing up that if an officer was shot on duty or ambushed in their car, it would be headline news across America for the next 2 or 3 days. The Sunday New York Times not only didn't even have it on its landing page, which had 75 stories, the top story was about cannibalism. And all these TV shows now, and people are developing, their words, not mine, a taste for cannibalism because of Netflix and this and that. Where are we in our culture as somebody who sits in sort of the epicenter of what drives us politically, when a cop being shot in a car doesn't even make the news in the paper of record? Yours is Democracy Dies in Darkness, I think. The other one's the paper. I can't remember. But cannibalism is the top story of the Sunday New York Times. What does that say about us?
Well, one of those things is unusual in America.
Continue.
We have become accustomed to gun violence in America, and to a degree that there were a lot of headlines in early 2021 when we got the data from 2020, the rise in homicide and in gun violence in America, the soaring crime rates and the rest of it. But generally, with the exception of very large mass shootings like the one in Uvalde, for example, or in Buffalo and places like that, the day-to-day gun violence in America almost no longer qualifies as news. And unfortunately, that also applies to police officers being shot in the line of duty. Cannibalism
Right.
is very unusual. I mean, I'm hoping
It's
very unusual.
it's a different twist on if it bleeds, it leads.
Very different, right? If it bleeds, it feeds.
Right. You were faster than me on that one.
But one of those two things is unusual, and I'm not saying that approvingly at all.
No, I know, and I hadn't thought of it that way. That people are so desensitized to the gangland shootings, the 15 shots in Chicago a night, that maybe police officers get lumped into it. But that really bothers me. It bothers me as a human. It bothers me as a lawyer. It bothers me as somebody in the criminal justice. I mean, people are being ambushed, but we're busy talking about Pete and Kim and where the private plane went the other night.
Right. Well, I mean, there are a couple of lines of thought there. One is our incredible consumption of celebrity news in America, and probably up in Canada as well.
Sure.
And again, the other is like, I one of the reasons that I went into journalism is I think that the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves are very, very important to the kinds of outcomes we get from public policy. And one of the stories that we tell ourselves, apparently in America, is that this is effectively a routine event. Now, obviously not for the officers or the families of their officers or their partners and their fellow police, but for the average news reader in America, or news watcher is probably as good or listener as good an example. That event in Rochester, regrettably, doesn't clear the bar for something unusual in America. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the data on the number of mass shootings in America, even since Uvalde, right? We've had, to say nothing of the fact that we've had a rise in homicide in almost every setting in America. It's not just the Chicagos. It's also the small and mid-sized cities that have seen surges in crime rates and in homicide. So we've become kind of inured to it. Again, not approvingly, just observing the fact that
that's your job. That's what you're an observer.
That it doesn't. Yeah. It just no longer qualifies as a significant news event.
That's very, very sad to me, because it earmarks, or it puts something out into our world that I think is very, very unfortunate, where we can't see our nose in spite of our face, or we cut off our nose to spite off our face, or however that old cliche goes. I want to take a quick break, Olivier, and when we come back, we're on Sirius XM Canada Talks channel 167 with Olivier Knox. This station talks a lot about Ottawa. I talk a lot about Ottawa. I do shows on the insanity that is the Trudeau era in Ottawa. I don't want to do that tonight. Olivier, you live in Washington, yes?
Yes, just outside of it, yes.
Just outside. So what I want to do when we come back in just 2 minutes on the Ari Goldkind show on Sirius XM Canada Talks channel 167 is I want to talk what it's like to actually live in Washington, to be in that ecosystem. And I want to start asking some questions about Biden, Harris, and somebody who's either near and dear to your heart or not, and that's Karine Jean-Pierre. Because I am a keen observer of what is said from the White House podium, let alone Joe Biden licking his plate the other night and showing it to us like a good boy. So when we come back in 2 minutes, we're going to talk to Olivier about life in Washington and what the chatter is there. Back in 2 minutes on the Ari Goldkind show. Welcome back to the Ari Goldkind show on Sirius XM Canada Talks channel 167. We're joined by Olivier Knox. First of all, a great Twitter account, and I don't often say that. I call it anti-social media. Olivier, I refuse to call it social media. I don't know why people call it that, but you've got a really interesting account where you actually speak your mind, not necessarily only your employer. So let's talk about the Washington Post for a second, but not really. Let's talk about you as a journalist in Washington.
Okay.
I haven't been able to ask any guests this recently because they're not the right guests, but I'm going to take a stab at it with you. Sean Spicer, when he was the bad orange man's press secretary for 10 minutes, when he spoke about the gathering at the inauguration, you knew he knew he was a liar. And everybody was sort of in on the joke. Skip ahead to Jen Psaki. I always thought she was prepared, she was intelligent, skillful, and she would actually take questions, and she sort of knew what she was talking about. Disagree with her on a number of issues, but she's there to represent the White House. I have never seen incompetence on a scale like I'm seeing when I watch Karine Jean-Pierre do a press conference from that briefing room, which to me, Olivier, and you say whatever you want, disagree, you could be best friends with her. I don't know, that we don't rehearse this stuff. I actually view that as a really important job. You're speaking to the American people and the world as if you are the president and as if you're furthering his message. And yes, I know she ticks two really important demographic checkboxes, which we're told is how and why she got the job. But as a journalist who understands cross-examination, because you ask questions, that's the Daily 202. When you watch her performance, and I use that in air quotes, how do you feel about the job she's doing?
Well, she hasn't, to my knowledge, she has not yet violated the Olivier Knox rule of press secretariedom, which is that American foreign policy is the same when you leave the lectern as when you got to it, unless you were explicitly directed to change it. That sounds dumb, but I can guarantee you that several of the press secretaries that I've worked with in my time covering the White House did not observe that rule, and much cleaning up had to be done as a consequence.
Well, Biden does that himself now with his gaffe, so I think they always have to rephrase what he says. But just her, when she,
I think your assessment of Jen Psaki is pretty much right. I think one of the things that they had coming in was they had staff who'd been with Biden or around Biden for so long. One of the benefits for reporters was that when communications director Kate Bedingfield, who's on her way out if she's not out already, when she said the president believes X, that was a real thing. I mean, She knew from years of working with him, she knew that she could speak that authoritatively, and that's helpful. To, you don't have to agree with what the president believes about a given topic, but it's helpful to know from a trusted aide a reasonably reliable depiction, getting a reasonably reliable depiction of the president's beliefs. I do not get the sense that Karine is as close to Biden as Jen Psaki or Kate Bedingfield. I don't cover the White House day to day, so a lot of my time is spent reading the briefing rather than watching it.
So you may not have seen some of the examples that I'm thinking of.
I think that's probably right. I mean, I think. And another thing I should say: I have no problem with a press secretary reading an answer from a binder. I would prefer that to freelancing. I once told, actually, a different White House press secretary, please do not force upon me the choice of either accurately quoting you or accurately representing policy. Don't do that to me. And it's more common than you think it is. I think I have. I mean, you can see it in the way that White House is reshaping its communications. I don't
know what you mean by that. Tell us what you mean by that.
I'm going to say that.
Okay.
So they elevated Karine from principal deputy press secretary to press secretary. She's doing the briefings. They have, I think, quite smartly handed the COVID briefing duties to Dr. Ashish Jha. So she's not doing quite so much COVID briefing. And then they brought in John Kirby, the retired admiral who was recently spokesman for the Pentagon and in a previous iteration was spokesman for the State Department. And so you have a foreign policy speaker in effect. And so they have the way they've shaped the press secretary's remit is they've taken a big chunk of foreign policy out of her day-to-day duties, and they've taken a lot of COVID science stuff out of her duties and given each of those to an expert. In reading the briefings and the gaggles, one thing that has kind of struck me is she opens cans of worms sometimes. So I'll give you an example. There was one briefing, I don't know, maybe a month ago, when part of what she was announcing was the departure of yet another press staff. They've actually lost a bunch of junior press staff. Some have gone to state, some have gone to outside organizations. And so she wraps up how valued this person is. And she says, I swear to God, we'll still have a press office by the end of the week. And all I could think of was, that doesn't interest me as a story, but I could think of some reporters at some outlets in DC who'd be like, oh, interesting point. What's happening? What is happening to the press staff at the White House? So she didn't need to say that. That was unnecessary. But she's not the only one making those kinds of comments. Again, I think Kate Bedingfield useful in the sense that when she spoke for Biden, she spoke authoritatively. But she had her own recent snafu when she gave a statement to my colleagues at the Post saying that it was not Biden's job to placate, I think she called it out of touch activists in the Democratic Party. And, unnecessary, completely unnecessary statement. She could have not said it. She chose to say it. She chose to pick a fight with the left flank of the Democratic Party, heading into a midterm election where they need the left flank of the Democratic Party. And so errors are not unique to Karine. I think I'd have to talk to my colleagues who cover her day in and day out because I'm so remote now.
No, that's fair.
That,
Look,
that I don't have as good an appreciation. I can tell you, I spent enough time with Sean Spicer to know that he would be very upset with your description of him, because what he was saying is that the audience for the inauguration was the largest ever, not the crowd. So the audience worldwide watching on streaming video was probably the largest.
I think I said it with some affection, because if you got it, I'll just say it. He knew that we knew.
Yeah, I know.
Right. So whereas this, I just watch, I don't know if it's stupidity, incompetence, a lack of preparation. I don't know. Maybe I grew up, look, full disclosure, Olivier, I loved The West Wing. To me, I mean, the show on NBC.
I get it.
Yeah, Aaron Sorkin. There's something special about it. And when you have somebody there that just looks unprepared, in the wrong position, there for all of the wrong reasons, that concerns me, not as an American. I'm not an American. But to me, that is the podium of the world. And I don't get to ask a lot of different people on this show because they don't work at the Washington Post. Let's move to, you gave a little sneak preview of where I wanted to go. You didn't know where I wanted to go, but the midterms coming up.
Yep.
2 questions. I have watched your paper, and again, you answer however you want or are comfortable, be extraordinarily deferential to the Biden administration for at least the first year and a half. And in the last couple months, I've started to watch these little tiny breadcrumbs of maybe the Biden administration can be asked questions about, or maybe you can criticize it a little bit. I want to ask you, am I sensing that correctly? Is there an editorial position on this? And 2, just picking up on what you said, given how tribal the US seems to be right now, whether it be about pronouns, Leah Thomas, the Don't Say Gay bill, grooming, TikTok videos, how important is the far left of the Democrat Party right now when people say they're going to get slaughtered in the midterms because they're farther left of, I don't know, as far as you can extend your left arm? How does that, I know those are 2 separate questions, but I always like to listen to what the guest says and follow up.
Right. So the party's left is very important because they provide a lot of energy and they get other people to the polls. And so in a situation in the midterms when historically the sitting president's party typically gets walloped, and you have something like 9 out of 10 Americans saying the country's going in the wrong direction. This if you'd asked me 2 months ago, I would have given you I would have predicted something of a bloodbath for Democrats. I think the terrain has changed a little bit with the Supreme Court decision on abortion, and a couple of the other ones too. But the left side of the party is actually really important. I mean, they're the ones who drive the other ones to the polls. They're the ones who knock on doors. They're the ones who are by definition active. The activists are active, so they're actually really important. You notice that I'm describing them as very important from a mechanical standpoint,
yes,
not from an ideological one.
Yes.
The ideological one, though, there's a number of issues in which the activists are running closer to broad public opinion than Joe Biden. I'll list you one obvious one, which is legalizing pot. Okay, that's a phenomenon that's happening in red states and blue states alike in America, and our 79-year-old president is clearly not prepared to take that step. But the activists are much more in step with the mainstream of American thinking right now on that issue, for example. So they're really pretty important. I'm trying to remember what your first question was.
It'll,
our tone. So I would
yeah.
say,
I read the Post, and I've noticed that subtle shift where if you criticize Biden, or even, God forbid, Kamala Harris, to me, the most embarrassing vice president probably in history, and that includes Dan Quayle, the Washington Post, not you, would call you a name that ends with IST. Now you can see, as I said, to use the term, these breadcrumbs, not going full Fox News, but some asking questions the way TMZ does it to avoid a lawsuit, or the Daily Mail does it, which is, Biden having affairs with 6 sheep, 3 question marks. Well, there wouldn't be that question 2 months ago. Now I'm noticing a change. Is there something that I'm noticing that's correct, incorrect? What's the culture in Washington like right now to a president and a presidency that, to me, no offense to I don't know your views, is a failure by every metric?
I think so. I'm going to try to keep all trace of defensiveness out of my answer.
Oh, because I don't know what
I think you're not correctly sensing that for a couple of reasons. For me, there were a couple of significant turning points last summer.
Okay.
In the coverage. The first few months of a presidency, there's a lot of like, well, this is TBD. Like, is he going to keep this promise? It's been 15 days. We don't know. Has he changed radically on this issue? We don't know yet. So there's a lot of poking and prodding. And a couple things happened last summer. I'll point to 3, actually. So one thing that's really near and dear to Democratic activists' heart is voting rights, preserving voting rights, beating back the Republican effort to take control of the electoral apparatus in America. And Biden's rhetoric ran way ahead of his policy. So he gave a speech, I want to say in July. He'd given remarks in the past describing these new Republican laws as Jim Crow on steroids, after the laws in the American South designed to disenfranchise African Americans. But he didn't call for ending the filibuster, the main delaying tactic in the United States Senate, in order to respond. And a lot of activists really soured on him in that moment. He eventually got there by December, but in that big speech, he let down a lot of progressives. And so you saw a real shift in tone, at least in private communications with progressives in America, with liberals in America, who said, we know that he's like the return to normal guy. And we know that he was the guy who rejected both defund the police and Medicare for all in the primaries, but it'd still be nice if he met the moment and in fact, acted as though he believes his own rhetoric, his own dramatic rhetoric about this. That's one thing that happened. Second thing that happened, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. That was probably the most sustained critical coverage of Biden to that point.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I remember.
I don't want to.
That's fair.
And I don't want to call it negative, because I think it was overwhelmingly fair coverage, but it was bad for Biden for sure.
Right.
And here's the big one. The big one is a stealth one, and I wrote about it on Friday. A lot of folks are pointing to the withdrawal from Afghanistan as the inflection point. Those people are not correct. The inflection point actually happened very, very quietly in June and July, with the rise of the Delta variant, supply chain mishaps, rising gas prices, so you had the economy and COVID. Basically, 2 of Biden's core promises were, I'm going to tame COVID, I'm going to bring back the economy. And in June and July, a lot of Americans started to doubt that he would. And you saw a significant slide in his Gallup polling before the Afghan withdrawal. And since then, we've got this old slogan dating back to President Bill Clinton's first campaign in '92. It's the economy, stupid. That is really worn on this White House's approval ratings and on the perception that Americans have of the country. Inflation is a deeply corrosive force. It's a global force, for sure. But like gas prices and like COVID, it's a global force that gets expressed in international media, national media, and here's the crucial one, local media. Like, you can't drive to and from your office without seeing the signs with gas prices on. This is a nightmare for any White House to beat back. No White House is equipped to fend off local media coverage of like, well, more people died in Sussex County, or well, gas prices in Idaho have reached a 10-year record. They're just not. And so just to recap all of this, there were turning points last summer, I think, not more recently than that. Not to say that there haven't been more recently than that, but those were the main ones last summer. And that, I think, is where you saw things sort of start to tilt. and again, it's not that there's a negative attitude. It's just that it's that stories that were objectively told but bad for Biden started piling up.
And it's interesting because one of the things you talk about, and I even remember going back, somebody has taken what he said, which is, I think he promised, and somebody put it out on anti-social media. My first job as president is I'm going to end COVID. And I'm paraphrasing, and I know it's there. It's his tweet. He's put it out there, and most Americans, thank God, don't use Twitter. But there's things that he has said that if a president does X or lets X happen, they should immediately be kicked out of office or impeached or whatever. And those things keep coming true. They're his account. Now, in fairness, he hasn't deleted them. I suppose my last question to you, and let's take 2-3 minutes on it because it's not one I want to rush. On the ground in Washington, is there a sense he will run again? I'm not talking about what people in Canada talk about or in Ottawa, but you have your ear to the ground. That's part of your job. Is there a sense he will run again? And part two of that question, leaving aside COVID, 4 shots, on Paxlovid, do you believe, as a journalist, if Trump was the president, well, all the things happening right now are happening, crime, inflation, you say gas, I use the term energy and groceries, because because unless you're a well-to-do person, you can't go to the grocery store and buy what you buy unless you want to eat junk food, which is the subject of shrinkflation. He has still, to me, gotten a relatively gentle ride from the outlets in power, the CNNs, the MSNBCs, the Post, the Times. Do you think, ear to the ground, he will run again? And do you think he has been treated the same way that the bad orange man would have been treated if the same things were happening under him that are happening under Biden? Take 2 or 3 minutes and we'll wind up there.
So on the re-election question, I think this is one of those times where he is running for re-election until he isn't. One of the interesting things, he had an exchange with a reporter not that long ago who pointed out that a majority of Democrats don't want him to run again. And Biden was very obviously unhappy about this question. And he came back with a different number from the same poll, saying, sure, 60 something don't want me to run. But when you ask him about me, I have a 93% approval rating. And I thought a couple things. We'll say, one, he clearly hates this question. But 2, he came equipped. Like he had that number at the ready, which tells me that that's a conversation they're having internally, and they discuss that poll internally. He is not combing through the crosstabs of job approval numbers in individual newspapers. That is not a thing the president of the United States does. So they clearly had that conversation. I thought that was very interesting.
Right.
The reality is, I suspect that he will say roughly what Donald Trump has said, which is the only thing that could keep me off the trail is if my doctor says I shouldn't do it.
Right.
And so as of right now, the way Democrats are feeling very fatalistic that he's going to run again. They're not. The ones I've talked to, the elected ones that I've talked to, don't want to see that happen. But as of right now, he thinks he still has a couple of years to right the ship. He thinks he's going to benefit from having a more conflictual relationship with Congress. And he and all Democrats hope that Donald Trump announces for re-election before the midterms, thus, galvanizing Democrats and giving some maybe on the fence people, making them take a second look at Democrats. So that's a very long way of not answering your question, but that's where I think he is. He's running until he's not. I don't think he's lying when he says I'm running for re-election. I think right now he absolutely is.
And I think that's very fair. And the number, and I think I know what you're talking about, where 60% don't want him to run again. But if he were to run against Trump, that's where the 90% number comes in. And that's why, even as a Canadian who watches this, Olivier, my hope is that Trump goes away, whether you like some of his policies, whether you like the bluntness, the uncouthness, the straightforward talk, it's not his time. And I'm hoping that it's Desantis against Gavin Newsom, because then to me, you've got somebody even worse than Biden, arguably. I've always thought Biden is a decent man. I think age and certain things have hampered him, and pressure and wanting to be liked by the far left plank. But to me, there's nobody more slippery and insidious than Newsom. And I think him versus DeSantis would literally be, with Vince McMahon stepping down a couple days ago, the ultimate battle that I think would energize both sides. I'm not sure if you'd agree on that, but give me 10 seconds on that as who you'd like to see the contest be.
Well, it would reduce the odds of America remaining a gerontocracy.
Fair.
I mean, the
very wise and safe answer.
I mean, we're no, I mean, but it's really a factor here. I mean, we are led in
old men
by a lot of old men, and so it'd be nice to see. I mean, I've given up on Gen X, being successful at all this stuff,
right.
but that would be. I mean, setting aside for a moment their personal styles and their ideology, it would be nice for the next or the next generation to get a shot at this conversation.
Well, I'd like to see that and see where we are come the midterms, and see if the bloodbath is accurate. And I'd also like to have you back to see who will be running, because to me, that's a contest that I think will interest many people around the world. Olivier Knox from the Washington Post, the Daily 202, easy Twitter handle @oknox. Find him on anti-social media. Olivier, great to have you on. I want to thank everybody for listening to us this week on the Ari Goldkind Show. Or if you're watching us online, we appreciate you taking a look at the video. If you're listening to us live, the Bilal Bakani Hour is up right after the show on Tuesday. If you're listening to us, as we're repeated many times throughout the week, we really appreciate you having a listen on Sirius XM Canada Talks, channel 167. Good night, everybody. And Olivier, thank you again.
My pleasure.